Hi there, just read this disclaimer please. Alright guys, since everything's falling heavily today on the market, I thought I'd just, well, my mate asked me, I thought I'd do some sort of worst case scenario analysis, would you say? I don't know, it's not very scientific, but so what I've done is I've put together, I mean it's kind of pointless because what I've done is I've just kept the portfolio as it is now to do little bits of analysis, but the reality is I'm probably going to be aiming towards this gradually, who knows, I don't know. But what I've done is I've put in here, these are only the dividend paying parts of my portfolio, because actually there's momentum as well which isn't in here because it doesn't pay a dividend. So what I've done is I've worked out how much dividends I'm getting paid at the moment, and I've put in estimates for like 5 really bad years, and I've kind of used the information from, where are we? The information from 2009. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I've kind of used these 4 years, and here's the dividend growth or shrinkage, as the case may be, record for some of the investment trusts that I own, and the ETF for FTSE 250. So what I've done is I've kind of used this information, the percentage growth. As you can see, City of London kept growing its dividend through the really bad years, where the FTSE 100 had a down year, and then a recovery. FTSE 250, big down year, big recovery. So yeah, I've basically I've kind of used it, but I've kind of made it in some places more pessimistic. So if we look at what I've done here is, well, basically you'll see that in 2007 was the peak of the the S&P 500, and also the peak of the FTSE 100, 2007. But actually, none of the dividends reduced until 2009. Even the FTSE 100 and 250 kept increasing. So it was actually a 2-year delay before the decreases. But I've made my worst case scenario even worse. I've just given it 1 year of being flat. So no growth in the dividends for 1 year, and then in year 2 I started to kind of use the data from 2009 onwards in a way. So I've kind of made my worst case scenario a bit worse than the financial crisis. But as you can see, I've put here what I've done for each one. Woodford money needs reinvesting in Merchants Trust, as I've mentioned before. So what I've done is I've accounted for that's wrong. There won't be any dividends from Woodford. So maybe in a year's time, I'll get the money back from Woodford. And I've accounted for a 20% drop in the value of Woodford before the money gets reinvested in Merchants. And then I've used the numbers that I've used for Merchants. I've repeated here for the dividends from the money that's in Woodford left over. City of London, I've kind of tempered the numbers. So 2009, I've done a 4% increase. Well, flat for that year, which is actually very pessimistic because it actually increased all the way through. From 4%, 2%, 4%, 4%, 4%. Whereas actually, it was quite a bit higher. 6%, 2%, 4%, 4%. So I've kind of, in a way, I've kind of used the data that happened, but I've actually made it lower in some cases. I don't trust the Murray International dividend growth over this time, because look, it was 16%, 27%. That seems too optimistic. I don't know what happened. Maybe there was a change of philosophy of Murray International's investment style, I don't know. But those numbers just seem crazy to me, so I've just put some kind of average numbers in. Kind of similar to 4%, 2%, sorry. 2% rise, 2% rise, 4% rise, 4% rise, 4% rise. And again, Lowland it was flat for 1 year, so I've multiplied it by 1. And then it had a very small increase, and it then went to like, what was it? 10% and then 11%. So I've just tempered that a bit. I've I've gone to 6% instead of 10%. And then Merchants and Finsbury, I've just used the exact data from theirs. 3% up, 1% up, 1% up, 1% up, 1% up for Merchants. Finsbury had a dividend cut, so I've got it in here, flat for a year, dividend cut of 7%ish, up 4%. So I've just used Finsbury's exact data. Again with BlackRock, it had some very big increases after a flat period. So BlackRock went big 20% increase, then flat, and then some really big increases. So I've just tempered that. It seems, I don't know, I don't want to presume it'll be that good again. So it's gone flat for a year, up 10%, flat for a year, up 10%, up 10%, up 10%. So it's like halving the increases in the dividends that happened in the financial crisis. The FTSE 250 tracker, I've just used the exact data, I think, yeah. Henderson Far East Income, I've just kind of, again, I haven't used them numbers, I've used lower numbers. Flat, up 3%, up 4%, up 4%, up 4%, up 4%. And then JP Morgan, no history here, and it's been a pretty flat dividend anyway, and there's hardly any left in it anyway. I've just gone flat for the whole period. Fundsmith and Scottish Mortgage, I've just halved and then risen. I've risen Fundsmith by 10% after the halving, because it's a bit more dividend focused than Scottish Mortgage. Scottish Mortgage doesn't really have dividend paying things. Although Fundsmith isn't dividend focused, it just happens to be in some that are actually pretty decent dividend payers. So I've given it a bit more of an optimistic outlook on the dividends after it's initially halved, because these two funds don't care at all about keeping their dividends high. So I've given them a halving in year 2 after a flat year. Aberdeen Asia Focus, 20% cut, then rises by 4%. So again, I mean, it's an investment trust. So no history for Henderson International Income. It's only started in 2011 or 12, I think. So I've just copied Murray International's data. 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%. Oh, 2% all the way through. That's not what I did for Murray International, is it? Oh yeah, it is. Oh, well, I've actually made it worse, haven't I? What am I doing here? Right, I'll make the last year's 4%. I don't know why I've made it worse than Murray International. There's no reason to think that. Okay, that makes more sense. Because Henderson International Income's actually a lower yielder than Murray, so if anything you'd expect it to grow its dividend faster. BlackRock Frontiers, just small increases all the way, because it's just had a dividend cut, so I would hope it wouldn't happen again. And then GSK and Shell have been flat for years and years and years. They were flat all the way through the financial crisis, so I've put that same again. And Barclays and Royal Bank of Scotland, I've put a complete dividend cut for those two, because they'd be the most cyclical ones. And so as you can see, I've counted how much money I've got inside my portfolio. I've still got £7 I could invest, and then I've got nearly £9 of cash outside the portfolio. So if I tighten my belt a bit and spend £13 instead of 14 grand, here's the numbers, and there's the that's how much I'd have to dig into my savings by each year, and then they've just accumulated that up. So as you can see, if I invested this £7 that's inside the portfolio, I'd last 3 years before I'd have to start selling holdings to fund living. I'd have to sell 2,700 odd the next year, £2.5 the year after, £2 the year after. But then if I don't invest the £7 and put it outside the portfolio, I could last 6 years before I'd have to start selling stuff that's in the portfolio. I mean, that's a very, this is tightening my belt, and only increasing my spends by 1% a year. So it's not like it's easy, but it's a worst case scenario that I could do, push comes to shove. And then, so those two scenarios, it's 3 years, then 2 years. The S&P 500 peaked in October 07. So 3 years later would be October 2010. There. So yeah, you know, not the best, but the worst of it would be over. The worst of the 50% drop in the market would be over for me. You know, for the anything that correlates with how the S&P 500 performs might be like that. And then for the FTSE 100, again October 2007, so October 2010, same scenario. It's lower values than the peak, but most of the big drop has been recovered. Or not, I don't know, maybe not most, but not the end of the world. But then if we go to the 6-year period, October 07 to October 13, somewhere around there anyway. We're back at the peaks for the FTSE 100. October 13. We're just a bit over the peak for the S&P 500. So theoretically I could just leave this in cash. But then, you know, why not go for the dip? If I put the rest of it in, the money this money would have been bought at a slightly lower ebb, maybe here, if we compare it to the previous years. And it would be sooner in the it would be in profit sooner than the rest of my portfolio that was put in at higher levels. So I don't know. It's a pretty I mean, it's a bad scenario to be in, but it's not the end of the world if we do get a repeat of the financial crisis. Or so, you know, obviously, what's the phrase? They don't repeat themselves, but they rhyme. Is that a Mark Twain? Is that a Mark Twain reference? History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Yeah, Mark Twain is reputed to have said it, but no evidence that he ever did. Anyway, there we go. Just a little sense check to make sure I'm not crazy. But as I've mentioned before, though, I'm not at all against going and doing some temp work. I'm still reasonably young. I'm 30. I'm below 40, so I could easily go and do some temp work. You know, the Christmas period, there's always peaks in demand for like order picking in internet warehouses that supply goods for internet orders. Anyway, there we go. Bit rambly, as usual. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.